Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for waiting. We were having some technical difficulties. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. And as you're all filing in, I see you all joining the webinar. It would be lovely to hear in the chat, if you could enter in the chat your name, your institution, where you're from, your role, if you like to share that. It's always fun. Sometimes we find a neighbor from another neighboring town or someone that we met at a conference. So feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. We would love to see who is joining us today. Hi, Steve. Hello, Sam. Welcome, everyone. Wow, so many people, John. We have a really full virtual room here in today's webinar. And as everyone is introducing themselves and filing in, I'm going to share my screen so you all may see the slides. Hi, everyone. Welcome. All right, thanks for introducing yourself in the chat. Unfortunately, due to some technical difficulties with Zoom today, we cannot see our wonderful co-host Shauna, but we have our audio, we have the slides, and so apologies. It's just my face, but we have the slides, and here is Shauna in slide form. So hello, everyone, and welcome to Art Appraisals and Inventory Management Best Practices and Insights, presented in partnership with Winston Art Group with Jana Hennig, our co-panelist. And we're so excited to have her here today. A few items before we get started for those that have attended an Artwork Archive webinar. This is not new to you, but we just want to clear up some housekeeping items. First and foremost, we are recording this session and it will be shared within 24 hours to all registrants along with the slides via email. We have saved time for your questions at the end, so please submit them via the Q&A icon, because chat we use to introduce ourselves and for any technical support that you may need. So my colleague Cassidy is manning the technical support end of things. And so if you need any help, please feel to contact us in chat. And lastly, we do have live transcript. And so please click the icon shown to access captions if you need it. And to get a better sense of who is on the webinar, both for myself, Shauna, and for everyone attending here, Cassidy, do you mind launching the poll? Thank you. We like to start off our webinars knowing, who is here today. So please feel free to answer the poll, asking what type of organization or collection you represent and your role within it, and how familiar you are with Artwork Archive. We share these webinars not only to our wonderful Artwork Archive clients, but on LinkedIn, various listservs, they get shared out. So we just like to know your familiarity. So welcome to those that are new to Artwork Archive and our educational resources. I see a number of registrars and collection managers, some directors and curators. Makes sense considering we're talking about appraisals and inventory management. A nice spread amongst art advisories and personal private collections, small museums and historical societies, academic institutions, and then the good old other. And so the mysterious 17% of the other. Shauna, is this helpful to see as we think about framing the content ahead?
Absolutely. I think a lot of what we'll talk to today will resonate with our curators and registrars. And I look forward to kind of hearing their insights at the end as well about what's important to them when they're engaging with collectors around their collection care.
Yeah, it's great. It's great to see. It's helpful. Okay, and then I'm going to end the poll now. Thank you everyone for sharing. That's helpful for us for framing the content that we present. So we can end that. And so a lot of you shared that you are new to Artwork Archive. So, who is the host of this webinar? We are an online art collection management system used by organizations, individual collectors, and artists to organize, manage, and showcase their artworks. I've been with the Artwork Archive team for 7 years, and really excited to be a part of this educational team that we have. Cassidy, my colleague on chat, leads the artist webinars. And so my background is in the nonprofit art space, working with artists and art organizations. And with that, a little bit about me, I would love to have Shauna be introduced. She comes from the Winston Art Group, and as you can see on this slide, they're the leading independent art appraisal and advisory firm. A little bit about Shauna. She's a senior director of the Southwest region with offices in Houston and Denver. I think we're both reporting from Denver today. Managing a multi-state region spanning Texas, the surrounding states, and the Rocky Mountains, with over 15 years of experience assisting collectors and advisors in art industry segments, including appraisal and advisory, fine art insurance, and finance. Shauna has established a professional focus on supporting clients and their trusted advisors in all aspects of collection management. Shauna is a frequent speaker, thank you, Shauna, on the art and collectibles market, including best practices for managing and planning, art as an asset class, market trends, and valuation. Shauna received her certificate in appraisal studies from the University of California, Irvine, and is compliant in uniform standards of professional appraisal practice. She studied art history at the University of Colorado, Denver, and received her BBA from TCU. Shauna is highly involved in local arts organizations in Houston and Denver, and she currently serves on the conservation committee at the Denver Art Museum, which I can just see down the road from where I am. Shauna is a member of estate planning councils in Houston, Dallas, and Denver, and an affiliate member of the Appraisers Association of America. So you can see why I asked Shauna to come and speak today as our expert panelist. Really excited to pick her brain and have her share her expertise. And with that, I'm going to mute myself and let Shauna take it away on why appraisals are important, why you're all here today.
Thank you so much, Elysian, and I'm glad we got video started. Sorry for the issues on my end with the technical difficulties, but yes, why are we here today? Why do people seek appraisals? Why are they important? So just to start, collectors will need different types of appraisals throughout their lifetime to meet different purposes or needs. The most common reason that people come to us in need of an appraisal is to as at the onset of their sort of journey through appraisal is for the purposes of establishing insurance coverage or to update values on their insurance schedule. That happens most frequently, and it's sort of a collector's first kind of entree into the world of appraisals. And then often this is something that's sort of like dictated by the insurance carrier or their insurance agent as they're collecting. Other common reasons that people come to us to seek appraisals include estate planning. This is kind of the world that I like to live in. It's really important at all levels of collecting, but it's often overlooked. And then, of course, for estate tax, if a collector sort of exceeds the IRS estate and gift tax exemption levels that are set by the IRS. For non-cash charitable deductions and donations, any donation over $5,000 will require a qualified appraisal. And then I say divorce/equitable distribution. Equitable distribution could certainly be for divorce purposes, but also, division of property amongst beneficiaries or heirs is another reason that people seek appraisals. And then, of course, in this sort of supercharged, art market of today, many private banks are lending large sums of money against the financial value of their clients' artworks. And an appraisal is needed to establish that loan to value. So often it's not uncommon for a client to come to us seeking an appraisal for a specific purpose, and then ultimately also need an appraisal for another purpose. So for example, they may need an update on their insurance appraisal or their insurance policy. And kind of while they're at it, they might start to do some estate planning and engage with their CPAs or attorneys on some estate planning. Or they're going to be lending something to an institution, so they need an insurance update. They might also do a fair market value appraisal at that time as well. So there's many different reasons. So in sort of thinking about the intersection of appraisals and good collection care, often when we're contacted by a collector seeking an appraisal, we typically start with a series of sort of fact-finding questions in order to provide advice on what to appraise and how to approach an appraisal project based upon what that purpose is. So we want to get a sense of the scope of the collection. Is it one or two pieces, or is it a collection of thousands of objects across multiple locations, right? Because those are different types of projects and we might approach them in different ways. Kind of depends on the type of objects and the need. So each collection, the need, the scenario is different, but fundamentally what helps us in providing the best advice to clients and ultimately accurately valuing items is it all hinges on good collection care. So we ask questions like, are there any listings? Are there insurance schedules? Do you have a spreadsheet? Have you written a list on a piece of paper that we can kind of review? Do you have paperwork like your original purchase invoices or past appraisals or condition reports? Have these pieces been seen by a conservator, or has there been any restoration? These are the sorts of questions that help to inform how we approach an appraisal, what type of information we're going to need. It's kind of essential as the foundation to, setting us up for success to most accurately appraise any given object or group of objects, and also to save our clients time and money, because it sort of sets us on the path when we have that good information. So sometimes in this fact-finding stage, clients will say, oh yes, I have my invoices in a binder, or I have this spreadsheet, or I have my insurance schedule, and we kind of look at those as a place to start. In some cases, things have been inherited and we have no information, and that can make things incredibly challenging. So, sometimes there are things that need to occur before the client gets to us for an appraisal. So just as an example, I had a client a couple of years ago who had inherited a work that her mother had shared with her was painted by the artist Diego Rivera. It had been in the family for many, many years, and she had started some estate planning and came to us. She had appraisals actually done in the past, but she had no sort of historical records about the import of the piece or the original purchase. There were some stamps on the back, but they were a little bit vague. There was no signature. And when looking at the previous appraisal that had been done by an auction house several years ago for insurance coverage, it noted they hadn't looked at the catalog raisonné to see if it was there. So, it was a situation where we didn't feel comfortable with our ability to provide her with an accurate appraisal for her intended use of the appraisal for her estate planning until she had gone through the process of authentication of the piece. So just as an example, sometimes things kind of have to be done before a client gets to the point of appraising. In some cases, we can make some assumptions. It depends on the work and the scenario, but in most cases, we want to make sure that a client has good organization, good paperwork before we set out on an appraisal. Next slide. So again, just kind of on a basic level on sort of what do we need, sort of piggybacking on the previous slide, just kind of the basics. The basic cataloging information about an object, as well as, if the work has ever been included in a museum catalog, or it's been exhibited in a gallery or in a museum. That information all helps to inform the provenance and the history of the work, and it can also impact the value. Obviously, if a work has been exhibited in an important exhibition, it can impact value. So if we already have that data and that information, it helps us in our research process to, sort of set us further down the path. So if a client doesn't have that information or knowledge, we can find it by way of our research, but of course it takes more time and thus more money. So it's always great when a client has already sort of prepared this information. And again, kind of in that fact-finding portion of our, the first step in engaging an appraiser in the fact-finding period, it's helpful when clients are forthright with paperwork and documentation. Even if they don't want to show it to us just yet, because they're not quite sure if they're going to proceed with an appraisal or proceed with an appraisal with us, it's great to just know if the paperwork exists, so that when we get to the point of research, we know what might be available to us to help inform our value. Additionally, we like to, in most cases, conduct a physical inspection of the pieces or collections that we're going to appraise. And of course, we're not conservators, but we do some conservation or condition notes when we're looking at pieces, and we can make recommendations if certain items need to be looked at by a conservator. It's great when a client already has a relationship with a conservator, even if there's not active treatment being completed, just to know that someone's looking at works on a periodic basis, or that they're sort of well cared for, that the conditions, the environment that pieces are being stored or displayed are appropriate for the pieces. So it's great to sort of have a physical inspection. Now, if a client or a collector has really good records, they have a good spreadsheet, or they have a collections management system, or they have good records, and in some cases they might have a registrar or a collections manager, we may not need a physical inspection if they have great images and great data. Again, a way to save time and money if there's already information available to us as appraisers.
That's great. And I just wanted to call out that I'll be sharing the slides afterwards. So you can just use this as a little checklist to make sure that you have all of these items for the pieces in your collection.
Okay, so I've talked a lot about lists, and I'll continue to talk about lists because they're a great place to start. So as I kind of laid out, collectors come to us to obtain appraisals for a stated purpose, whether that's for insurance coverage or estate planning or estate tax, all the reasons. And this purpose is really what guides us in our advice on what to appraise. We're not telling clients sort of why to appraise items, and in some cases we might tell them what to appraise, but it's really informed by the stated purpose. We're not necessarily just engaged by the collector. Again, if we're being hired to appraise a certain number of items for an insurance coverage, we might also be in contact with their insurance agent or carrier, or for the purposes of estate tax or estate planning, we're working with a CPA or an attorney. And so it's sort of a triangulation of all of the parties on determining what items need to be appraised. So lists, again, are a really important part of this, or having historical data on a collection. I can't tell you how many times we're contacted for an insurance appraisal, for example, and you sort of have that first conversation and they say, well, I don't have my invoices. I bought these something like 20 years ago. Can't quite remember when and where. I was on vacation in New Orleans and we bought these things and now I'm needing an appraisal. It's a really difficult place to start, especially depending on who the artist is. They might have some value, but it might be difficult to find that information if we don't kind of have a starting point. So just any kind of lists or historical information is really great. Here's another example, again, as it pertains to insurance. So, as part of sort of the annual review, an insurance agent might tell a client, let's update a schedule and value the things that have, that might have a retail value over $25,000. Okay, that's great. So the client comes to us and says, we want to value everything that might be over $25,000, and we are looking at a group of jewelry pieces, or we're looking at a group of art pieces. Now, some things it might be quite obvious, but other things might kind of toe a line, and we're not quite sure if they're going to be over that threshold or not. So we might err on the side of let's go ahead and value it because we're not quite sure. But if we have past invoices, or we have a schedule that sort of states previous appraised values, or we have a past appraisal, we can use that information to inform whether or not an item needs an appraisal again. Additionally, if we see that an item was appraised several years ago, at that level, it may not need to be updated. But if they don't have that information, we are going to tell them to get the item appraised because, we don't have that information. So it's really important, again, to have like good documentation as a place to start. Also, in the case of like an estate situation, when we're working with like division of property or trying to divide things amongst, children, it's helpful to sort of set a threshold. You don't necessarily need to be valuing, sort of the $100 items, but as a family, you may decide there's a certain threshold at which it's important for us to have values. And, just having that data just helps to kind of set us on the right path.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm actually thinking, I know a lot of the collectors that use Artwork Archive create collections within their Artwork Archive account, and they'll have bequeath to Sam, bequeath to Amanda, to keep track of all the things that they're giving to their children and to others, so that there's no question or uncertainty.
I definitely strongly recommend, especially with division of property or donation for that matter, just sort of estate planning generally, when you know what items are going to be sold or gifted or donated, to mark those intentions. If things are transferred into a trust, to make sure that the ownership is properly cataloged so that we are clear about who owns the item, how it's being planned for or organized. Those requirements might be different depending on the ultimate sort of disposition of the item. So that's a really good point. And location is, I'll bring it up in a little bit, but noting, who a beneficiary is and an item's location can be critically important. And again, I'll get into that a little bit in the future, but yeah, definitely important.
I'm also, I'm nodding along too, because I know that those that attend these webinars, we have the collectors, but we also have the receiving institutions. And so I love this conversation, and for each group to know what's going on the other side of the fence, so to speak. And so how important it is for collectors to have all this information documented and easy to share to then the institution that they're donating to. So all the records, everyone has the information and the data to preserve these artworks and the legacies. So that's my little contribution to that. And I'll let you get into the type of appraisals, because this is a good one.
Yes, this is a question we get a lot. And it's not the easiest concept, but there are different types of appraisals that are used for different purposes. And I'm sure many of you know that, but it's still something that kind of trips up collectors or users of appraisals from time to time. And in fact, the situation came up for me yesterday as I was sitting with a family who was preparing to sell a group of jewelry pieces, and they were very excited about the value on their appraisal, and you know, achieving that with our assistance on the disposition or sale side of things. And you know, as I looked at the appraisal, I realized that they had an insurance appraisal, a retail replacement value appraisal, that they were using in order to inform the values that they could potentially achieve at sale. And that is not congruent. So for the purposes of insurance, we use retail replacement value, which is sort of the amount that it would cost to replace an item with one of like kind and quality within a limited amount of time. So this is typically like the highest price of an item in a retail setting. It's kind of the buy side of things. And you can kind of think of it like if, you know, God forbid the house burns down and the insurance company has said, okay, here's the money to go and replace that item with one of like kind and quality. You cannot necessarily wait until the next auction comes up that might have a piece, but might not have a piece. You need to be able to go to a dealer, to a retail setting to find that object. And most typically a retail setting is going to have a higher price than an auction price, just by nature of its retail. So on the insurance side of things, you want to make sure that you are valuing and insuring your collections at retail, because if you're using an auction or a auction data or a fair market value, you may not have enough insurance coverage. And then conversely, if you're estate planning or obviously charitable donation, you wouldn't hopefully get into a situation where you're using an insurance appraisal, but we definitely see it in other situations where clients are inappropriately using old appraisals and the wrong type of appraisal. So for fair market value, which is most typically used for estate planning, estate tax, etc., we want to use that fair market value, which is the price of a property, of an item, as it would sell in an open market between a willing buyer and a willing seller, neither being required to act and both having reasonable knowledge of the relevant facts. There's no time compulsion to buy or to sell the way that you have in in an insurance situation. So this is kind of a differentiator, and typically the de facto market for fair market value is the auction market. That is the market for the secondary market. So you kind of think of it as, if and when I pass, where will this object sell? Well, most likely it will sell in an auction setting. So that's what we use for fair market value. It's typically a lower price than a retail price. And then marketable cash value is essentially the fair market value, but net of the fees involved. So the fair market value will include like the buyer's premium, and it will include all the costs of selling. And the marketable cash value would be the net of those. And it's most typically used for loan to value for a bank loan and or for equitable distribution. Any questions on that? It's kind of a tricky, and I gave some examples here just sort of to illustrate the delta between what a retail price would be and then a fair market value or auction price might be. And for different pieces, that delta is different. And anymore with certain works, you'll see that kind of being a kind of closer, but it really depends on the object and the market.
No, you outlined that beautifully, and I just want to add on at the end of this presentation, I have some links to articles, and we have definitions of the different types of appraisals with examples. And just a shout out, I see Adrienne is on this webinar as well, and she hosted an incredible webinar with us a few months ago about insurance, because she works with Huntington T Block. So a lot of good content on that insurance coverage and the importance of the retail replacement value. And so if you're interested and you want to keep the learning going, we have that recorded on our webinars page. And I saw a question, there is a question about the frequency of appraising an oil painting. And so I was like, how perfect, because
you're reading our mind. So we get this question a lot. How often should I get my collection appraised? And the frequency of an appraisal really varies depending on the purpose of the appraisal, the market for the particular object, and scholarship. And scholarship changes can impact the value of a piece. And I can get into an example of that. Like, so for some items, like emerging contemporary art or watches or Hermes bags or some memorabilia, where markets have been strong in the past few years. We see some items that need to be updated every 6 to 12 months. And for other categories, like our brown furniture friend over here and our silver, perhaps less frequently because the market is generally speaking more stable or even soft. So, it may be something where, well, I will say, 10 years ago, we valued these sorts of things frequently, and anymore we're valuing less and less, just because the market for these things, like, will they come back? I mean, hopefully, maybe. But at this point, it's, really depends on the type of material. And it's important to keep in mind, like the art market alone has upwards of 125 unique markets. So it really depends, emerging contemporary art is going to act differently than art of the American West or, Asian antiquity, or, each market's going to kind of work on its own level. So I would say it's not a bad idea to have a relationship with an appraiser, even if you're not using them all the time or on an annual basis, so that they can provide you with kind of a review, again, back to the paperwork, do sort of a collection assessment or a review to determine if values have fluctuated. And I'll give you kind of an example here. So this painting is by the artist Maria Barrio, and it kind of exemplifies the sort of emerging art, sort of stratospheric rise. This work, He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not, we purchased for a client in 2019 for $13,000. In 2022, the client opted to sell this work with a pre-sale estimate at auction between $500,000 and $700,000, and it's sold at $1.6 million. So if you're not paying attention and you also bought a Maria Barrio in 2019 and you're going about your business and you're not checking in on your appraisal, you will be grossly underinsured. And obviously from a planning perspective, you could have some, issues if you have not updated your, wealth advisors and your attorneys about this value. So just something kind of exemplifying, again, I sort of touched on other markets where we're sort of seeing this, these sort of hot markets, and luxury handbags are another one. I have several clients, one in particular who is in Boulder, who's in sort of a high fire area and has an extensive collection of handbags. And we inventoried everything, and then we have appraised the top sort of Birkin bags, these sort of Hermes Birkin bags, which, the Hermes sort of limits the number of bags that they make every year and how many people can buy. So it suppresses the market. They sort of average about a 14% increase in value every year. So it's something where we have a good inventory of everything. And then for her Birkin bags, we sort of do an update every 1 to 2 years, sort of depending on where the market is, just so that she's in line on her insurance policy. Same thing with sports memorabilia, largely dominated by, baseball, but we've seen basketball memorabilia kind of having a moment, especially, Jordan and LeBron James and Kobe Bryant, et cetera. So just other markets where we're updating more frequently versus, so all of that to say, for some things it might be a check every year. For other things it might be every 3 to 5 years. It really depends on the item. I would recommend as a best practice to at least have a collection reviewed on an annual basis, even if you're not updating values.
That's helpful to know. I'm like, let's repeat that like three times, 4 times, 5 times.
Yeah.
I saw within the Q&A, I didn't want to go ahead before bringing this question to you because it's about the types of appraisals. As an art museum, what type of appraisal should they request art donors get? Fair market value?
Absolutely. And I'll get into that. I can't remember if it's the next slide or not, but I can speak to it now. Perfect. Wonderful. So this is actually the perfect segue to a qualified appraisal. So for our museum folks, if someone is donating a work, and they're going to take a tax deduction and they're going to get an appraisal completed, it must adhere to IRS and Uniform Standards of Professional Appraisal Practice guidelines. And those guidelines sort of outline, they're sort of the minimum standards that an appraiser must meet. We don't have regulation as personal property appraisers. We don't have something of a certification. So really USPAP is the bare minimum guideline, and it's what the IRS requires for a qualified appraisal that is going to be submitted for non-cash charitable contribution. So if a collector is donating something, we must have, and they're going to take that deduction, they must have a qualified appraisal. That includes, certain information, including comparable market data. It has a scope of work. It has, the information about the appraiser and their qualifications to appraise that item. It is a legal document of value. It has to include the donation paperwork. The appraiser has to sign off on the 8283. So it is a more formalized process. So absolutely, it's a fair market value appraisal for a donation. Bottom line, I mean, we definitely see outside of donation, particularly in an insurance case, we'll see these sort of flowery appraisals on, like gold paper with like this sort of old English font, and it looks very formal, but it's a lot of air and there's not a lot of information. It leaves you sort of wanting more. When I say air, I mean, it kind of feels like the person doing the appraisal has pulled the number out of thin air. These appraisals are typically done by dealers. So like a jewelry dealer, in some cases, an fine art dealer who, is providing as a courtesy an appraisal on behalf of their clients if they bought certain items, and it doesn't necessarily have that comparable data or a narrative that helps the reader, the collector, or the advisor, or the IRS in some cases to understand how that appraiser arrived at their value. So if you're seeking out an appraisal, if you want to get to the next slide, I'll kind of parlay into this.
Great.
You want to make sure that you are hiring a qualified appraiser. Someone who has, demonstrates the education and experience to value the item that's being appraised. We strongly recommend, as I mentioned, we don't have a sort of, you could be a donut shop owner today and an appraiser tomorrow. So we strongly recommend hiring an appraiser who is a member of a professional organization like the American Appraisers Association of America, or the American Society of Appraisers, because they have a rigorous requirements for membership as well as continuing education. It can be very easy, again, to go to your dealer, to go to an auction house to get an appraisal within lifetime, but it can really trip up your plans down the road when you're trying to sell or dispose of items, because there's that lack of objectivity or qualification to actually appraise. So again, just making sure that the appraiser that you're hiring is actually an appraiser and not just an art specialist in some other capacity. They certainly have expertise around a certain item, but going back to those appraisal standards, there are standards that we have to adhere to as appraisers that often we don't see in these other appraisals done by those who are not truly appraisers.
And that reminds me, when I give demos of artwork archive to collectors or organizations, I always share how within context you can keep track of your appraisers, and you can assign tags to keep track of this information, or you can include the society that they are a part of within the notes or the bios, just making sure that you're doing your due diligence. And if you leave, the future registrar, collection manager, director knows that they have those credentials, which is a great way to track it.
Perfect. So just a couple of kind of examples of collections management, the intersection of collections management and appraisal gone wrong, and maybe I'll dabble a good one in there too. But I'm going to show
an example of artwork archive, so that'll be the good one.
Oh, fabulous, good, fabulous. So we've had several situations sort of relating to insurance claims where clients have no record whatsoever of the items that were lost or damaged. It puts us in a pickle as appraisers trying to identify what the item is and how we go about appraising, the item or group of items. So for example, recently we worked with a client who tragically lost a collection of Native American baskets in a home fire, along with the documentation. So they had kept all of their invoices in a binder in the same home that sadly had burned down. So they essentially had no record of these baskets nor the baskets themselves. And of course, how do we appraise items? In fact, all that they had was like a picture of their holiday photo with the baskets in the background on their bookshelves. It was, a situation where without proper record keeping or paperwork and some digitization and maybe some listings and having had things sort of appraised or looked at in the past, unfortunately, we were not in a place where we could assist this client with appraising. So it's, again, important. We also had a situation where a client was loaning some artwork to an institution, and they had not completed a condition report before the pieces left their home. And unfortunately, they had sort of sat in storage for quite some time at the institution before the exhibition. So it was very unclear as to when the damage occurred. And without those condition reports, it was very difficult for, the conservators involved and the insurance people involved to sort of determine what damage was already there and what things were, or what damage was. Yes, condition reports, very important. So again, kind of like the frequency of appraisals, I think it's good to have a conservator in your Rolodex. And of course, different conservators do different things. So you'll want to, paper conservator or a books conservator or a paintings conservator. And, even within paintings, it might depend on if the artist is living versus whether they have passed, whether you would want to engage, with the artist studio to see who they might recommend, or if they have, good practices for conservation care. It's good just, to have a plan and to have a Rolodex of specialists who can help you to support your stewardship and preservation of these items and maximize value. As we get to the next slide, and estate disposition, because you'll have to do something with this collection. Of course, for our museums, it's a little bit different, and for our museum curators, it's certainly a little bit different. Yeah, sorry, I was reading. Anyway, the needs are a little bit different, but the things that we can do as collectors help to support the long-term care once things have been donated or gifted. And of course, if you're going to sell, it can maximize sales. So I'll just sort of give a couple of examples here. I worked on an estate last year. This is an extreme example, but I think it's illustrative. So this particular collector passed away unexpectedly. He had a collection, it turned out, of approximately 20,000 individual objects for the purpose of estate tax appraisal. In some cases, we were able to group those, but 10,000 objects over something like 10 locations. And the collector had been keeping a collections management system. His family office had also been keeping a collections management system. Their system had about 2,000 objects. His collection didn't have quite 20,000, but closer to that, and they were not communicating to one another. So when we came to appraise this collection, we were under the impression that there was far less material than what we ultimately found. So again, in that kind of estate planning phase, something to do in a lifetime is to sort of make sure that everyone who is involved are speaking to each other. So whether that's a family office or a state attorney or a wealth planner or CPA, everyone's sort of on the same page about the scope of a collection can be very important. Additionally, there were works that were found in museum storage, and they had been there for upwards of 20 years, and nobody kind of knew if these were long-term loans or if they had actually been fully gifted. There was no gift documentation. We weren't quite sure if, these were just here for storage because he was an important donor and on the board of the museum, or what the reason was. But we found this group of things at a museum and weren't quite sure if they were part of the estate or not. So again, just sort of making sure that everyone who is involved is on the same page. And I was going to say this in a bit, but I think it's important to state here too. So when kind of setting out on a collections management plan, I think it's really important, or if you're going to implement a collections management system, even if it's just a spreadsheet, have some clear parameters and think about how this system might be used not only by you now and in the future, but by others. So it's not a one size fits all. Some collectors are really building a collection that may turn into a private museum at some point, or maybe donated to an institution. So thinking in advance about how you at the end of or at the disposition point, when you're building that plan or that collections management system, can be really helpful. It can feel daunting depending on where you are in collecting, but it's a great way to kind of think at the end and kind of move backwards and have some systemization, standardization, and frequent updates. Also, just kind of back to your point, Elysian, about having a good record of your intentions. So, I've had a situation where in an estate appraisal, we have directives that to my eldest daughter, I give the long strand of pearls. And then you realize that she's been married several times. There's several daughters from several marriages, and you open the jewelry box and there's lots of long strands of pearls. And it's hard to know exactly which strand the decedent had intended to give to which daughter. So to be very specific about things that are being disposed or gifted or sold, having very clear directives, very important.
Yeah, and especially that's where images are helpful. So one may have a particular type of clasp. Also, you reminded me with the storage, I'm on the AAMG listserv, and there's been a lot about what happened with essentially abandoned works that were loaned. And I'm seeing best practice within museums to have within your loan language that says, if it's not picked up or retrieved in 5 years, then it becomes a donation into the museum's collection. There's some good questions as I pause my share so I can bring up my screen. Within the Q&A, speaking of photos, a question about, if the museum has really good photos of the artworks, do they need to have the appraiser take photos as well?
Not necessarily, but it really depends on the purpose of the appraisal and the requirements. I completed an appraisal last year on an extremely important work that had been loaned to a museum and was on exhibition. But the work had recently been purchased by the collector. So we had really great condition reports and high resolution images. And we stated in the appraisal that the piece had not been physically inspected by the appraiser. In other situations, if it's a bank loan, they may require, or certain insurance providers require, the appraiser to physically inspect the work in person. So it really depends on the scenario. If we have really good high quality images and it's not required by any party, then certainly we can appraise virtually. It helps if there have been condition reports completed by a curator or conservator, but it really depends.
Yeah, I just wanted to show, so I'm sharing my screen for those. So there's a number of you that use Artwork Archive right now for your collection management system, either as a private collector or an organization. What's great is that when you upload your high-res images, you can share them directly out. So you can send them off to your appraiser, you can download them. But just really wanted to hone in and emphasize like all of the best practices that Shauna was sharing. So having high-res images, multiple images of the works. As you can see, there's appraisal history. So please do add those appraisals, all that hard work. Maybe go back and see if you have any on gilded golden flowery paper that you may need to update. Really easy to add an appraisal. So if you are tracking your appraisers, you can add them from your contacts, the value that they assigned, the date, the file, so that documentation, and updating the values. And so then you do have that track record. Location tracking, as Shauna mentioned, really important, provenance. But I wanted to scroll down because there was a question about, is a certificate of authenticity required for that appraisal? So Shauna says yes, make sure that.
I want to touch on that because
Yeah.
authentication is not sort of one thing. It is artist specific and it changes. Scholarship changes and requirements change. So what you thought 30 years ago when you bought a work may not be the going standard of the paperwork or authentication that is needed today in order to sell or to export or to pass on. So it's really important. So I'll give an example. I have a client who purchased a work by the artist Guy Wiggins about 10 or 15 years ago from a reputable dealer. He did everything right, where we think the dealer was fine. Guy Wiggins' son was the authenticator for his work, and he passed away. And this collector, as he was working on his estate plan and we started to get into the appraisal, we realized he didn't have a letter of authentication from the estate of Guy Wiggins from the son. Unfortunately, the son has passed away, and until the Guy Wiggins estate, as well as the son's estate, can kind of figure out who will be the next authenticator of the artist's work, we're sort of in a situation where this work is kind of in limbo. So we can make some assumptions, we can provide values, assuming authentication and assuming no authentication, and provide some values. But it's one of those situations where, again, good collection care and organization, making sure that if keeping up with the scholarship and market changes of any given object, because those are not static.
Yeah, that's great. I'm going to jump out of Artwork Archives. I just wanted to use that as an example for making sure you're keeping track of all of that important information and keeping up with the information as it changes, or as our industries and the scholarship changes. I think that's the thing is sometimes people may think that art collecting is or an art collection is quite static, thinking of archive, dusty shelves, but it really is a very active practice. We have just a few moments, especially because we started late. Apologies for the technical difficulties. There's a few more questions that I would love to get to. Shauna, do you just have anything, people sign off this webinar, like what's an actual nugget that people can take away to feel like they've gotten something?
Yeah. Something I didn't touch on that I think is helpful is, garbage in, garbage out. So the information, if you're, something as simple as a spreadsheet or a list, or, setting up a collections management system, is to have a system. So maybe it's the Getty object ID formatting of how information is entered, because a lot of times we'll see systems where some things are the height time by the width, and then it's like the width time by the height. So having consistency of input of information is an important factor as well. And so I think that's something like at the onset of creating any sort of lists or spreadsheets or collections management, that you really think about who's going to be using the system, what information is important, how is the information entered, so it's accurate. And, you know, if a registrar leaves and another person comes or something like that, that the information is, we see that a lot.
The continuity.
Yeah.
We touch upon that in some of our articles, which again, these are all hyperlinked. So when I send the slides out, you'll all have access, but you can also read about valuation, inventory best practices, how to put not garbage in, but put some like choice organized information for generations to come to preserve your collections. And then also just like a little lasting, if you like this type of content, we're going to get into some Q&A definitely, because we have some more, but just wanted to share that, you know, these amazing webinars that we have with experts like Shauna, thank you so much, and Adrian from our insurance webinar earlier, we announced them in our newsletter. So if you want to keep tabs, feel free to sign up. And then also if you are looking for a collection management system, we work with organizations, we work with collectors, and you can schedule a demo with me if you want to just hear me talk more. And then we also have a free trial. And then for those that are using Artwork Archive, we have tons of video tutorials. Cassidy, my teammate, is updating a lot of our help docs and tutorials. So thank you, Cassidy. So if you are looking for ways to add appraisals, update various valuations, you can do so within Artwork Archive. But I just want to get to these questions because they're great. So if do you have a few minutes, Shauna? I know some people may have to jump off.
Absolutely, of course. I love questions. It helps. Yes.
If the art collector who is donating an artwork is not taking a tax deduction, should an art museum still require an appraisal? Also, if an artist is donating a work that they've made, should an art museum still require an appraisal? And I just have to say, I love this. My dad, I didn't say it in my intro, but my dad is a painter, and getting to that point of preserving his legacy. So this is great. Thank you for the question.
It's a great question. I can't speak specifically, but I would say if they're not taking a tax deduction, it might be your preference as an institution to still ask for an appraisal for your records, just to have sort of a, you know, a point in time. So there are no questions in the future. Like if you're going to deaccession for some reason or something is, you know, there's records just to sort of, again, there will likely be some sort of a, deed of gift, but it is sort of an additional enhancement to that. So perhaps if they're not, for an artist, the requirements are different of what they can donate. I think it's more so their material and time versus the actual value of the piece. I'm not an accountant. Definitely something to consult with an accountant, but that's sort of my recommendation. And then my understanding is that museums can't recommend appraisers because of the potential conflict of interest. Is that correct? I think that's also institution by institution. And I think that's understandable. I think what I would recommend an institution to do is to direct that collector to the Appraisers Association of America or the American Society of Appraisers, where they can find an accredited appraiser within, you know, the context of the type of material that's being donated, because then they know that that appraiser has the qualifications to, you know, write a report that is compliant. So I would just recommend guiding that client to a professional organization.
And then how would you approach appraising a large history collection that may not have a significant retail replacement value?
I'm working on this right now. Well, sort of not appraising it, but working with a collector who has some important historical documents, super interesting, but very personal and very specific to a certain region. So they're not works that may have sort of a market value. It's more of a, you know, definitely from a research perspective. I wouldn't say just from a sentimental value. These things, you know, might still have kind of intrinsic value or importance in the, you know, historical canon, but not necessarily a monetary value. I would still recommend really good record keeping, even if you're not appraising. We certainly see, and this is something, I could have stressed as well, that they don't necessarily go in tandem, right? Like you can definitely have a really good inventory and not need appraisal. So it's still material that I would strongly recommend having really good images, really good documentation, but it could be that you don't need an appraisal in order to have insurance coverage on that collection, or maybe parts of the collection require some appraisal, but not everything.
Gotcha. And then, oh, I'm just looking at someone responded to a question.
I'd love to know.
I love also, since we work with artists, how do I document authentication when I am the authenticator?
That's a great question. That might be a question to present to other artists who have systems. I think whatever you're doing, I would be very consistent from start to finish. So whatever you've done from the inception, or if you haven't done that thing, so if you're stamping them or you're providing certificates of authenticity, if you have a really good catalog and you can note the items that have been created but that don't have this certificate or stamp, that you note that, so that if an artist or a collector down the road tries to sell or gift that object, that they don't have that certificate, and maybe you're not available for whatever reason to provide that it doesn't diminish the value because they don't have that authentication. So I think it's a great thing as artists sort of start to sell or gift works, that they think about that as part of the process of their practice.
And then speaking of that, a question of, is the COA mandatory, the certificate of authenticity, for an appraisal?
It goes to Sam's question too. Can I recommend authenticators? It is so object specific that you have to be very careful. We see letters of certificates of authenticity that are very flowery wording, but they're not the sort of standard authenticating body for such this specific artist. So each artist and type of object might have different requirements for authentication, and market kind of drives that, or whoever that authenticating body is. There are certainly processes that we can help clients go through, but it's so object specific or artist specific.
Yeah, this is great. I have actually an artist question. I was responding to questions, typing too, so you may have answered this, but are artists allowed to appraise their own art, or do they still need a certified appraiser if they're donating to a museum?
That's a great question. I think, again, this is probably a CPA question, because my sort of understanding is that as an artist, you can, deduct the cost of the materials. So the cost of those materials exceed that, threshold where you're submitting that to the IRS, that $5,000 threshold, then I would say, yes, you would need an appraiser. But I would sort of talk to a CPA, and also think about what is the cost of the materials involved. If you have a very complex practice, it might be very expensive to produce a work, and that might be necessary. So it kind of depends.
Yeah,
everything depends. Sorry.
I know. Helpful, but not helpful, right? So like, what is, well, Francie has a question of, how do you value artwork for shipping insurance? This would be artwork by an artist that has only had some sales history.
So again, we're kind of looking at a retail replacement value, and we might be searching for works of like, kind, and quality, hopefully similar works by this artist, even if they have limited history. If we can't find works in a retail setting that have sold or are being sold that are similar, we might look to the auction market or to other markets and sort of add a premium to the value, theoretically, what a retail price might be based upon, secondary market auction sales. But if an artist doesn't have a market, we might compare to another artist that also has a limited market. So it kind of, again, there are avenues to it, but it kind of depends on the scenario of how limited the market is for that particular artist.
I just have to gush. I was just talking to the Artwork Archive team. What I love about Artwork Archive is that like we are the arts ecosystem. We work with artists, we work with collectors, we work with collecting organizations. So following the lifetime of the artwork, right, from being made to preserved. And I love that we have these artist questions too, and hopefully it's helpful for museums and other nonprofits working with artists and collectors. They can recommend as well if they get these inquiries.
I hate, just please indulge me. I know we were 10 minutes over, but for our artists, one example that I had kind of prepared but didn't mention, but I think it's important for artists to think about. I'm working on an artist estate right now. This gentleman passed about 12 years ago, and he named his nephew as the trustee to his estate and had not communicated to his nephew what that role entailed and the fiduciary obligation that he had as a trustee to the estate. This artist had some historical sales and exhibitions and some acclaim, but it was slightly limited. And we have upwards of 700 artworks that are being stored in non-climate control storage. And the spreadsheet inventory of this collection ranges in age like 10 to 15 years old, the information. So we're in a situation now where the trustee of this artist estate is having to come up with money within the estate to create, from a fiduciary obligation to the beneficiaries, a collections management system, a condition and collection care plan, valuations on certain items. So these are things that really should be considered in your practice, and making sure that you have a really good, inventory and plan, so that, down the road, anything that's sort of remaining has a good plan.
And then I know we're over time, but one more question. I'm also going through chat, and I see one. Let's end on one. Kelly is currently getting a collection value overall. She is doing this for insurance purposes and only doing individual appraisals for works over the top end of their blanket per item limit. Is this wise, or should I be individually appraising items over a certain dollar value without consideration of insurance limits? Great question.
That's such a great question. And I think that goes back to sort of the triangulation. We are, as appraisers, can provide advice to our clients based upon the objects, right? Because we have an expertise on the items and where their values might be. But it's so important to also engage the insurance provider who is the expert on the coverage that a collector has. And in tandem, communicating and talking with a client about their own risk tolerance, sort of a three-way conversation. So for some clients, if the per item scheduled limit is $250,000 and they have $1 billion collection, well, that's fine. But that's kind of high for most collectors. So we find clients want to value or schedule items that are of a threshold, like, maybe depending, I'm gonna give a broad range here because it kind of depends on the collector, but it could be $5,000 to $50,000. So you kind of decide what is your risk tolerance in consultation with your insurance provider and with some advice from the appraiser to determine. I think your approach is perfect. I mean, you determine what your risk tolerance, what's going to keep me up at night. Is it over $50,000, or is it everything over 5,000? I mean, you may not need to do everything over 5,000 because your insurance provider can provide a blanket policy, but you might still want to make sure your paperwork's up to date, and that you have a good inventory, because again, if there's a loss situation, you want to have some sort of record. So I'd say you don't necessarily have to have everything appraised. I think that's where really the consultation, that kind of first part of the presentation, really doing a lot of fact finding up front and making sure we're aligning the client's objectives and their needs with our advice on what could be appraised.
That is great. Oh my gosh. We've had a lot of people stay on way past the hour. So thank you, everyone. Your thoughtful questions and participation to all the attendees really makes these webinars so helpful. And of course, Shauna, with your incredible expertise and the way that you framed the content was wonderful to consume.